Hello, Jennifer. Welcome to Resourceful Women, where we share stories about women in the mining industry. What I'm excited about today is that you have not only your own story, but you are directly involved in investigating and looking at and considering the stories of women in mining more broadly. So I'll pass it over to you to introduce your organization and the work that you do, and we will go from there.
So my name is Jennifer Adams, and I work for an organization called Catalyst Plus. It's a Canadian economic development organization. We've been around since 1967, and we're formerly known as a Canadian Executive Service Organization. We're a not-for-profit that works in Canada and in 30 countries around the world. And so much of the work that we do is done through Canadian advisors who volunteer their time to support the needs identified by our different clients. The work is practical, it's accessible, and adapted to the local context in which we're working. And just to note, the majority of our funding overseas comes from Global Affairs Canada, and in Canada, it comes from Indigenous Services Canada, CanNor, and different territorial and provincial governments.
That's excellent.
So for today's discussion on women in mining, I wanted to refer to women in mining broadly, looking at how the mining sector impacts women at the mine sites and women working in the mining sector and government, women living in mining impacted communities, and women involved in the mining supply chain, because all the work that we're doing is linked to these different components of women in mining.
Well, that's excellent. One of the things that I was excited about in talking to you is that you do have that very broad look at the industry. And I think that's something that is really impactful when it comes to discussing, gender issues in general and specifically in mining. Uh, not necessarily everyone, but there are a lot of people who don't necessarily grasp the reach, the impact, and all of the different industries that touch and interconnect and intersect with mining. So I'm excited to hear your take on the industry in that very broad view.
Good, good. And I can tell you a little bit about how I got into women in mining. Um, and it starts from almost the beginning. I grew up in Canada. I was born in Canada, but I left when I was 3 years old, and I grew up in an international development framework in Latin America and then in Africa. And then I came back and I studied international development. And one of the key things that come out is gender equality is a key driver for inclusive and sustainable development.
Hmm.
Um, and understanding that 1 in 3 women are impacted by gender-based violence in some way throughout their lives gives you the breadth and depth of the reach of this topic and
Hmm.
the importance of working to address it in a very collaborative manner. So I was drawn to women in mining in about 2012 when I was working for a different not-for-profit organization, a Canadian organization that was hired by a Canadian mining company to conduct a needs assessment on the root causes of gender-based violence in male-dominated workplaces. And we were hired to do this in 4 of the mine sites, so in Africa, in Australasia, in North America, and in Latin America. And we were then tasked with developing a strength-based strategy to proactively address the challenges of gender-based violence, focusing on the positive role that men have in preventing gender-based violence. And that was really exciting and very interesting. I think for the most part, companies tend to have a reactive process and strategy when these issues happen. But it was very exciting to be working on the front end, on the proactive. And people at the mine sites were really interested and engaged in working with it. First of all, it took some time to get to that stage, but once they got to know us and what we were trying to achieve, there was a lot of support. We found a lot of champions.
Yeah, I was immediately imagining the difficulty of establishing those conversations in mine sites. But it's like you say, looking at how to ensure that women are safe at work is I think, a much more exciting and more encouraging, optimistic, productive way of looking at it rather than dealing with the outcomes when they are not. So after violence, I think the prevention aspect of looking at how to not just, make sure that things are dealt with properly if an incident occurs, but looking at how to prevent those incidents in the first place. So I'm very curious about the findings that you had.
It was fascinating work because each mine site is unique and each
Hmm.
requires its own strategy. There are some cross-cutting themes, but you really have to look at that unique site and the context. So, for example, in one of the sites, one of the key drivers of gender-based violence was financial literacy, the lack of financial literacy. So we designed programming with the miners and their partners because it was a very isolated site where the families lived together.
Mm.
So we were able to provide that training for both of the partners, and knowing that mines pay quite well. It's an industry that pays quite well, and it's a lot of pressure on people who don't necessarily have a strong background in financial literacy to all of a sudden have large amounts of money and people all around them wanting a little bit of that money as well. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of pressures that puts on a family and a lot of responsibility. So working together to have a plan for that family to use the money that they're earning.
How are you able to make those connections between the financial change, which most people would consider to be very positive? How are you able to connect that to violence prevention?
We start with the needs assessment. So before we developed a strategy, we talked to the people running the mine, we talked to the mine workers, we talked to NGOs in the communities around them, we talked to the families, we talked to government at different levels to understand the issues from all these different perspectives. And
Hmm.
then we're able to develop the strategy around financial literacy training. And we know also from the company side, there's a lot of pressure because a lot of the workers in this particular site were overspending and asking for loans up front, asking for their salaries early, which puts
Uh,
pressure on the company as well. And when you
hmm.
have loan sharks showing up on payday, there's a whole infrastructure around it. But through follow up, these aren't just one off trainings, but this was developed over a 5 year period, and through metrics and checking up with people and following up with the different actors, we were able to demonstrate that this was having an impact in reducing the level of violence and the level of stress within the homes.
Well, that's amazing. I'm sure you have some success stories to share without, oversharing anybody's particular story.
Well, certainly. Well, one thing to understand too is that mine sites attract people from so many different communities and cultures and worldviews and experience that it takes a real focused effort to bring people together and have a common understanding of what, for example, constitutes harassment, and then an
Mhm.
understanding of what the role is that they can play in preventing it and what are the steps that they need to take. So in some of the other mine sites, it was just building a common understanding of what constitutes harassment, and then working with the company to have the policies and procedures in place and the training available. And that was exciting to see that it was just something quite simple, but being able to communicate those messages and build that understanding in a very accessible way, and then relating it directly to their role and their context and their culture, because culture is so important in each one of these sites as well.
My mind is absolutely zapping with the the richness and demand of all of that communication. Um, was it was it co-developed with the people I'm guessing that it was co-developed with the people in the community and the mine. I'm curious, what was the delivery style?
Yeah, everything we did was co-developed because there had to be understanding, awareness, understanding, and ownership as
Hmm.
well. So in one of the mine sites, for example, when we approached them, they said, well, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing going on. But we saw that in the community, it was the number one, let's say, province for men killing their wives. And it had
Oh.
been for many years in a row. So what was going on in the community was obviously going to be reflected to a certain extent to what was going on at the mine site in
And I
terms
would
of,
say, even if it wasn't happening in some degree at the mine site, just the impact on the community of having that kind of violence would be, there would be spillover in terms of consequences, regardless.
yes, yes, yeah.
So the blindness to that was, were you able to delve into that?
Yes, certainly. And very, again, very slowly over the 5 years, raise an awareness of the connections and raise awareness of the positive actions that can be taken at a mine site with people and involving people to address these issues and to prevent them. Um, we worked with communities, we worked with Indigenous communities that had high levels of violence within that community, and using again that cultural context, that worldview, to ensure that the messages were accessible and that there was ownership for those messages. And to create a space, a lot of the work we did was just to create a space for this discussion, because it's so often missing. And unless you do create it, the discussion doesn't happen. People are aware of what's going on, but don't have an opportunity to share and to put it out in the open and to look for solutions together.
So you're describing almost a three-party perspective sharing. In those cases where you were seeing success, what did the company contribute to that success?
The company was key. They were funding this work,
Hmm.
and they had a vested interest in, so their people, their staff were very active in participating, and they were also active in communicating what was going on. And as an international mine site, they had sites all around the world, so communicating the work that was being done, and and trying to share that and build understanding and build again that creating that space for dialogue on
Well,
what the
that's
company
excellent.
was doing. Yeah,
So
yeah.
that was the community part. Your part, I would imagine, would be providing the expertise to listen to both the community and the company. What else would
Yes,
you
yeah.
bring?
We brought the
Hmm.
approach and the expertise to this role. And we worked with local consultants as well and brought in that local knowledge and that continuity too.
Hmm.
Because when the training could be delivered in the local languages, that was a huge benefit and help. And to local consultants who are aware, for example, in the financial literacy of the local banking and mining practice, as well as the cultural pressures that they know that the miners are experiencing.
Hmm.
So
If
there was
one,
that another level of understanding that they could bring.
yeah, if one person was earning, the notion that cousins would be showing up,
Very much so,
I think
yes.
is something that I've seen as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's like, hey, cousin. It's like, hey,
yeah,
have you
yeah.
come for tea?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating as well. There are so many stories in that. So the community contribution would be that local expertise, and then beyond the expertise, how are you able to get community interested in participating? Because I know that's a gigantic challenge.
Yeah, yeah. And it's through building relationships, spending a lot of time and building relationships, building trust, building awareness and understanding. Um, the bulk of my experience with women in mining actually comes from working on a project on governance in Mongolia. And in this situation, while we were working to promote responsible mining practices, in this case based on Canadian experience and lessons learned, with
Mhm.
different levels of government, there was also a very strong community engagement component. So we worked with the government to understand how to build skill sets and practice in engaging communities. So that was over impact benefit agreements so that they were aware of what they were. And the government, on the other hand, was aware of the community needs and voices. And that in that context, it was very important to ensure that women's voices were heard. Women were at the table, their voices, their needs, and their experiences were heard and then taken into account into the impact benefit agreements, or when we were working on policy or mine closure plans, that their voices are heard and taken into account in those plans. And that's again a long process
Mm-hmm.
of building awareness with the different actors. For example, when we worked in Mongolia, we worked with the Ministry of Heavy Industry and Mining and Heavy Industry and the Ministry of Environment on the very first mine closure plan in Mongolia. It took us 21 months to work with the regulators, a state-owned mining company, the local government, a team of local consultants, and community leaders to implement this closure plan under the 2019 regulation. So nobody, although they had the regulation, they weren't sure how to implement because it had never been done before. So
Oh,
it was a
okay.
real process to build that understanding of what it takes to develop a mine closure plan and how key the community engagement is to that plan, that process of ensuring that those voices are heard and that the role of women, for example, that what understanding the role women play and the impacts of mining on women so that they can be taken counted into the closure plan.
That's fascinating to me at the level of considering economic development, sustainable economic development, and, increasing the capacity in the mining company, leaving the community more empowered by their presence rather than less empowered. Were you able to track and see any changes in the numbers of women involved in the business of it, like women as employees? Did you see
Uh,
changes there?
as employees in a company, not so much. We worked a lot in procurement. So
Hmm.
supporting women, small and medium enterprise with a focus on women-owned enterprise and helping them to connect to the mining supply chain. And we did that by working again with local government. So local government would sign the impact benefit agreements with the companies,
Hmm.
and there would be articles within those agreements that outlined how many jobs should be created, how much procurement should be local. So using that tool, we worked with the local government, who would be the bridge between the mining company and the small and medium enterprise business owners in that community. We also worked with the banks and we worked with the local chambers of businesses to ensure that the small businesses understood the needs of the companies, the
Hmm.
quantity and the quality that they required, and where possible, work together to be able to ensure that they could provide that those products. And in Mongolia, it tended mostly to be products rather than services.
Okay.
Um, but a lot of very successful female business owners. One of the most successful females that we worked with had a boot business, and she made mining boots for the miners and was able, through the training and the work under this project, build her business to a national level. And funny enough, we brought her to Canada to the Prospectors and Developers Association conference,
Oh,
which
yeah.
happens every year.
Hmm.
And we had a pair of her boots, and a group from one of the Indigenous communities saw them and said, "Wow, those are really nice boots." And the climate conditions in Mongolia are very similar to Canada. They're very cold.
Hmm.
So they had winterized boots. And because of that, this Indigenous community invited the Mongolian entrepreneur to their community in northern Quebec and had an exchange. And then the woman was able to understand Canadian credentials for the boots and tailor her boots so that they met those standards for mining boots. And they're under discussion now to see if they can start importing her boots.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a beautiful story
Yeah, that is
of what's
really
possible.
Yeah, that's really cool. In all of my reading and everything that draws me to the mining industry and everything else is I've always looked at a mining project as an economic engine, and how well can that economic engine run? And can there be, you know, meaningful, lasting community development and economic development that, has been supported by the mine's presence, but isn't entirely dependent on the mine's presence. And that I think is a really neat story. So it got someone into the industry, and doing the entrepreneurship. Um, there's something that always kind of tickles at the back of my mind whenever I am considering cross-cultural mining things. And you mentioned it earlier on that it's a Canadian company that has um, international operations. And I think that's, in and of itself is a really great way to, Canadian standards are often higher than the regions that global companies go into. And I'm wondering if you have any examples of that sort of thing where you could see that direct kind of exchange of knowledge and standard, whether it was safety standard or interaction or financial, in play, where you were able to, have that positive share of Canadian style of operation into a new place, and how that was taken.
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of respect for Canada and Canada's experience in the mining sector overseas, especially in Mongolia. It's highly, highly regarded. So we worked with the Ministry of Mining and Heavy Industry on a petroleum safety policy. It was the first of its kind. They didn't have one. And so we worked with a small environmental organization out of Alberta, and they worked to design the the safety policy for the petroleum sector. And they did it by bringing together the people who worked in the ministries. They brought companies to the table, and they brought academics, and together they sat and they discussed the policy, and they discussed their different, again, viewpoints and components to make
Mhm.
sure that when they did create a policy, it reflected the needs and interests of the key stakeholders. So that was a very, very dynamic and interesting procedure to create that policy. And then we also worked for several years with the Ministry of Mining and Heavy Industry on a petroleum resource management standards, the PRMS. And that was, again, a Canadian organization came in and introduced the PRMS to Mongolia. And then it took several years to build the understanding and to have a decision made that this was the system that they wanted to move forward with, and then adapt it and adopt it to their context. I just want to say one of the challenges with many countries is that the policy and legislation is a little bit outdated. So bringing it up to international standards really helps these countries to attract foreign direct investment.
There is just no end to the benefit of that type of collaboration. I think that your experience, I know that we have just scratched the surface of it, and I think it's fascinating to me in particular as a communications person, and someone interested in sustainability, to look at the potential that we have when we get the people in the room who can make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
I think that might be the most exciting part for me in hearing what you have to say. Is getting the people in the room is no small feat. Getting the people interested and having that co-creation. In everything you've said, I think the co-creation aspect of it is probably where the success has come. Is that Does that match with your experience of it, or is there some other key part of the practice that makes it all work?
Yeah, no, it's very much that dedicated team who really understands the context in every mine site, every government office, every community. We met people who wanted to contribute and to be part of the solution. So those champions and role models within the organizations, are so critical because they're the ones that can keep the work moving forward, build that sustainability into the work. And it includes the buy-in from leadership too.
Hmm.
That's so important. And one of the challenges is with government is a high level of turnover. So working at people at a technical level, you have more of a chance that every election you'll have your champions stay there. So
You're a
that
little
was an
more
important thing.
ever so slightly election proof.
Yes, slightly. It's not foolproof.
Yeah.
But it's worth noting that these champions, in the champions that we worked with over the 8 years in Mongolia, is where we saw the biggest change in terms of
Mhm.
understanding, in terms of support. And a lot of those people went on to be promoted and are now in decision-making positions. And that's so valuable.
That's an not I was going to say that's an amazing story, but really I feel like you've shared an amazing set of stories with us. And the potential and the positivity in all of that is, I think that has deep and wide-reaching appeal. For me, the communication part of what you've said and the cultural sensitivity part of it, I think is really valuable as the mining industry touches through culture. It attracts people from different cultures into a home country culture, whatever that is. I just think the potential for learning, cultural share, and that meaningful governance that you spoke of was really, really meaningful to me. And when we talk about things being election proof, the type of governance that you're talking about at the industry level, I think it is closer to being election proof when you can get those solid, well considered policies into place. They are so protective of the economy, people's health, the health of communities, and safety in general for not just women, but I would imagine that in every operation where you're able to improve the lives of women, that everybody's lives improve as well. And I'm
Very
curious
much
if
so.
that's my imagination or if that's something that you've seen.
No, it's definitely something that we've seen at all levels. And it does take a multi-stakeholder approach to make this happen. It's an issue that has so many different entry points, but the impact, and also I think it's important to understand the attitude and behavior stage takes time. It takes time to understand, to meet people where they're at, to provide the training and then the support throughout the process. And it's really the process that's so valuable because that's where the learning is taking place.
Hmm.
Um, but the impact of all that is enormous when women's voices are heard and women are able to contribute all the great wealth that they have to the sector. And I think the whole sector, men and women, are so much better off for it.
Well, I couldn't ask for a better summation of everything that you're working on. I think that's fantastic, and I thank you so much for your time today. And hopefully we're able to do some updates, and anyone who's listening is able to grasp, those very important threads that you've used to connect community, industry, and culture. So I thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure.
Well, thank you. And I wish you all the best. I'm sure you continue doing great work.
Thank you.
Take care, Jennifer. Pleasure chatting today.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Resourceful Women is a product of the Prospector News. Opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speaker and speaker alone. Resourceful Women is for educational and entertainment purposes, and nothing in the podcast should be taken as investment advice. Always consult with a licensed personal financial advisor before making any investment purchases.